They told Benjamin and Clara that their children belonged to the master, not to them. But on a suffocating August night in 1856, those two parents made a decision that would either save their family or destroy it completely. They would use the only weapons they had, their minds, their cunning, and their unwavering love, to steal back what was never the master's to own in the first place, the souls and futures of their 3 children. What followed was not just an escape from physical bondage, but a psychological war waged by 2 people who understood that the greatest threat to slavery was not violence, but the intelligent, strategic resistance of people who refused to let their children inherit their chains. Before we begin this incredible journey of courage and intellect, I want to invite you to be part of our community. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss powerful stories like this one. Stories that honor the brilliance and bravery of those who fought for freedom using their greatest weapon, their minds. Now, let's enter the world of Benjamin and Clara and witness how love and intelligence can overcome even the most brutal oppression. The Thornhill plantation stretched across 300 acres of Georgia soil, red clay earth that had drunk the sweat and blood of generations of enslaved people who worked from dawn until darkness swallowed the fields whole. Benjamin stood at the edge of the tobacco field on that August evening, his hands still trembling from the conversation he'd had with Master Robert Thornhill just hours before, words that had changed everything, that had transformed him from a man trying to survive into a man preparing to risk everything. "Your boy Samuel is 10 now," Thornhill had said, examining Benjamin the way one might examine a horse or a piece of equipment. "Old enough to be leased out to the Anderson plantation for field work. They need strong young backs for the harvest season, and I need the income. He leaves next week." The casual way Thornhill had announced the separation of a father from his son, as if discussing the lending of a tool, had awakened something in Benjamin that he had kept carefully hidden for 32 years, a rage so pure and focused that it became not weakness, but weapon. Benjamin was a carpenter by trade, skilled in the construction and repair of buildings, furniture, and the 1,000 items that plantation life required. This skill had made him valuable to Thornhill, had kept him from being sold away from his family, had given him access to tools and materials, and most importantly, knowledge. He had learned to read by watching Thornhill's sons receive their lessons, memorizing letters and words with the same precision he brought to measuring timber and calculating angles.
He had taught himself mathematics by necessity, needing to understand measurements and quantities for his work, and had discovered that numbers were a language of power, a way of seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. Now, as he stood in the fading light contemplating Thornhill's announcement, he began to apply that analytical mind to the most important calculation of his life: how to get his family from Georgia to freedom without getting them all killed in the attempt. But Benjamin couldn't plan this alone, couldn't make decisions that would affect 4 other lives without consulting the woman who was his equal partner in all things, the person whose intelligence matched his own and whose courage had sustained their family through countless trials. Clara worked in the main house as a cook, a position that required her to be in close proximity to the Thornhill family, to hear their conversations, to understand their rhythms and routines. She was 30 years old, had been on Thornhill plantation since she was 12, sold there after her previous enslaver died and his estate was liquidated. She had given birth to 3 children in bondage: Samuel, 10 years old and brilliant like his father, already showing an aptitude for learning that both thrilled and terrified his parents; Grace, 8 years old, quiet and observant, with a memory that captured everything she saw; and Eliza, 5 years old, their youngest, who still believed the world could be kind if you smiled at it the right way. That evening, after the enslaved people's meager supper of cornbread and beans, after the children had been settled in the cabin that the family of 5 shared, Benjamin and Clara sat on the wooden step outside their door, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry to the neighboring cabins where the ears of informants who sometimes traded information for small privileges. "Thornhill's leasing Samuel out," Benjamin said without preamble, knowing that Clara would understand immediately what this meant, would grasp the urgency of what he was about to propose. "Next week. Says the boy is old enough to earn his keep in the fields. Once he goes, we might never see him again. They could sell him, work him to death, do anything they want because we got no rights, no protection, no say in what happens to our own child." He felt Clara's hand find his in the darkness,
felt her fingers intertwine with his, and knew that she was already thinking what he was thinking, already moving to the same conclusion that had been building in both their minds for years. "We run," Clara said simply, and those two words contained worlds of meaning, years of unspoken planning, decades of suppressed hope crystallizing into decision. "We take the children and we run, use everything we know, everything we learned, every advantage we can create. We've been preparing for this our whole lives without even knowing it, Benjamin."
Every time we learned something they didn't want us to know. Every time we figured out how their minds work. Every time we kept our intelligence hidden while gathering information. We've been arming ourselves for this moment. Question is, are we ready? Can we do this without getting our babies killed? The question hung between them in the thick summer air, heavy with the weight of parental love and the terrible knowledge that staying meant watching their children be destroyed piece by piece, while running meant risking immediate destruction for the slim chance of freedom. Benjamin had been thinking about this for years, not actively planning, but rather collecting information the way a carpenter collects tools, storing away knowledge against the day it might be needed. He knew about the Underground Railroad, that network of safe houses and brave souls who helped fugitive slaves escape to the north, had heard whispers of conductors who made regular trips south to guide people to freedom. He knew about the North Star, how to navigate by it when clouds covered the sky, knew about following water to hide scent from tracking dogs, knew about the patterns of patrol routes and the times when surveillance was lightest. But he also knew about the horrors of capture, about enslaved people hunted down and brought back to face punishments designed to break not just bodies but spirits, to serve as warnings to anyone else who might consider running. "I've been thinking on this for 3 years," he admitted quietly. "Ever since Grace was old enough to understand that we ain't free, that we don't belong to ourselves. Been gathering information, making observations, planning routes in my head. I think we can do it, Clara. Think we got a better chance than most because we got something they don't expect. We got intelligence they don't know about, and we got each other." The next days passed in a blur of desperate preparation hidden beneath the mask of normal routine. Benjamin continued his carpentry work, but now every task served a dual purpose. When he repaired the smokehouse door, he pocketed the small pieces of metal that could be fashioned into tools. When he was sent to the neighboring Anderson plantation to build a new chicken coop, he mapped the route in his mind, noted the locations of creeks and forests, calculated distances and travel times. When he worked on Master Thornhill's desk, he caught glimpses of documents and maps, committed them to memory with the precision that had made him an excellent carpenter. Every moment of apparent submission was actually reconnaissance, every gesture of obedience a cover for resistance, every day a step closer to the escape that would either liberate or doom them all. Clara's preparations were equally strategic, equally dangerous, equally essential. As cook in the main house, she had access to the kitchen stores, and she began, carefully, methodically, taking small amounts of food that wouldn't be missed. A handful of dried beans here, a bit of salt pork there, matches wrapped in cloth, a small knife that could be explained away if found. She hid these supplies in a basket supposedly containing scraps for the pigs, which she would carry to a hollow tree near the edge of the plantation where Benjamin could retrieve them later. But her most valuable contribution was information. She listened to every conversation in the Thornhill household, heard Mrs. Thornhill discussing social visits with neighboring plantation owners, heard Master Thornhill planning a trip to Savannah for business, heard the casual mentions of which overseers were more vigilant and which were lazy, which dogs were best at tracking and which were old and unreliable. Every piece of information was catalogued, assessed, turned into tactical advantage by a mind that slavery had tried to keep ignorant, but had instead sharpened through necessity. The children, of course, couldn't be told the full plan until the last possible moment, but Benjamin and Clara began preparing them in subtle ways. They taught Samuel about the North Star under the guise of pointing out constellations, taught Grace to identify edible plants during walks to collect firewood, taught little Eliza to be quiet and follow instructions without question by turning it into a game. "We might need to take a long trip someday," Clara told them one evening, her words carefully chosen to prepare without alarming. "If we do, it's important that you remember everything Mama and Papa teach you. Remember to be quiet when we say quiet, to run when we say run, to trust that we're doing everything we can to keep you safe. Can you remember that?" 3 young faces nodded solemnly, not fully understanding, but sensing the gravity in their mother's voice, the way both parents had been tense and watchful for days.
But time was running out faster than they had anticipated. 2 days before Samuel was scheduled to be leased to the Anderson plantation, Benjamin overheard a conversation that accelerated everything. Master Thornhill was planning to sell Grace to a slave trader who was passing through in 10 days, a man who specialized in buying young girls for domestic service in wealthy households across the South. The news hit Benjamin like a physical blow, confirmation that the family he and Clara had fought so hard to keep together was being methodically torn apart, that if they didn't act immediately, they would lose their children to a system that saw them as commodities rather than human beings.
That night, he and Clara made the final decision. They would leave in 3 days, during the new moon when darkness would be their ally, when Master Thornhill would be away on his business trip to Savannah, when the overseer would be alone managing the plantation and more likely to be distracted or complacent. The night before their planned escape, Benjamin lay awake on the thin pallet that served as the family's bed, his 3 children nestled against him and Clara, their breathing soft and innocent in sleep. He thought about what they were about to attempt, about the dangers that waited in the darkness beyond the plantation boundaries, about the possibility that his decision to run might get his children killed rather than freed. "Am I doing the right thing?" he whispered to Clara, voicing the doubt that had been eating at him. "What if we fail? What if they catch us and punish the children for what we done? How can I live with myself if my choice to run ends up hurting them worse than staying would have?" Clara's hand found his face in the darkness, cupped his cheek with a tenderness that made his eyes burn with unshed tears. "We already losing them, Benjamin," she whispered back. "Samuel being sent away, Grace being sold, Eliza growing up knowing she ain't worth nothing in the eyes of the law. That's a death too, just a slower one. At least this way we fighting for something better. At least this way we showing them that their mama and papa believe they worth risking everything for." The day of the escape dawned hot and thick with humidity, the kind of oppressive Georgia summer day that made every breath feel like drinking from a cup of steam. Benjamin worked on repairing the barn roof, a job that put him high enough to survey the plantation, to watch the overseer's movements, to note which enslaved people were working which fields, and who might notice their absence when darkness fell. Clara prepared what would likely be Master Thornhill's last meal before his trip, her hands steady as she cooked despite the riot of fear and anticipation in her chest. The children went about their usual tasks, Samuel helping his father when carpentry work allowed it, Grace watching her younger siblings while the adults worked, Eliza playing in the dirt outside the cabin with a cornhusk doll Clara had made her. To anyone watching, it was a day like any other, unremarkable in its oppressive routine, ordinary in its denial of human dignity. But as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Benjamin of fire and blood, the family began their final preparations. Clara retrieved the hidden supplies from their various caches, combining them into 2 bundles small enough to carry but substantial enough to sustain them for the first days of their journey. Benjamin checked the tools he had hidden: a small knife, a length of rope, flint and steel for starting fires, a small compass he had stolen from Master Thornhill's desk weeks ago and hidden so carefully that its absence still hadn't been noticed. They fed the children extra portions at supper, knowing that meals would be scarce in the days to come, and then waited for the darkness that would either liberate them or doom them to fates too terrible to contemplate. The plantation settled into its nightly routine with agonizing slowness. The enslaved people returned from the fields and gathered for their evening meal, exhausted from another day of forced labor under the brutal sun. The overseer, a cruel man named Garrett who took pleasure in finding reasons to use his whip, made his rounds, checking that everyone was accounted for, that the quarters were secure, that his human property was properly contained for another night. Benjamin and Clara played their parts perfectly, appearing tired but not tense, engaging in small talk with neighbors, putting their children to bed at the usual time while whispering instructions for them to rest but not truly sleep, to be ready to move when the signal came. Then came the waiting, hours that crawled by while they lay in their cabin listening to the sounds of the plantation at night, waiting for the moment when Garrett would retire to his cottage, when the other enslaved people would fall into exhausted sleep, when the window of opportunity would open just wide enough for a desperate family to slip through. Midnight arrived with the silence of a held breath, and Benjamin knew it was time, now or never, do or die, the moment when everything they had been planning would either succeed or fail spectacularly. He touched Clara's shoulder in the darkness, felt her immediate response, heard the soft rustle as she woke the children with gentle whispers. "Remember what we taught you," she breathed into each small ear. "Quiet like mice, following right behind Mama and Papa. No talking unless we say it's safe. We going on that long trip now, the one we've been preparing for? You ready to be brave?
3 small heads nodded in the darkness, and Benjamin felt his heart swell with love and terror in equal measure, as he realized his children were trusting him to lead them either to freedom or to destruction, and there was no way to know which until it was far too late to turn back. They slipped from their cabin like shadows, each person carrying a small bundle, moving with a silence born of desperation and practice. The quarter was dark, except for the faint glow of a few banked fires visible through cracks in cabin walls, and the sounds were only the usual night noises: snoring from exhausted workers, the cry of an infant being soothed by its mother, the occasional cough or rustle as someone shifted in sleep.
Benjamin led them between the buildings, using routes he had mapped in his mind, keeping to the deepest shadows, avoiding the paths where moonlight might make them visible to anyone who happened to look out a window. They reached the edge of the slave quarters without being spotted, and now came the most dangerous part: crossing the open ground between the quarters and the tree line where the forest began, where they could disappear into vegetation thick enough to hide them, but also thick enough to slow them down. "On my signal," Benjamin whispered, watching the overseer's cottage for any sign of wakefulness, listening for the sound of dogs that might have caught their scent. "We run quiet and fast to the big oak at the forest edge, the one with the lightning scar on its trunk. Don't stop, don't look back, just run, understand?" He felt Clara's hand squeeze his arm in acknowledgement, heard the barely audible whispers as she passed the instructions to the children. Then he counted to 3 in his head, said a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening to the prayers of enslaved people, and whispered the word that would change everything. "Now!" They ran across that open ground with hearts hammering and breath coming in quick gasps, expecting at any moment to hear the shout of alarm, the baying of dogs, the crack of gunfire that would end their escape before it truly began. Samuel stumbled but caught himself, Grace's hand locked in a death grip with her mother's, little Eliza bouncing on Benjamin's hip where he had scooped her up to move faster, all of them racing toward the tree line that seemed impossibly far away, that appeared to recede rather than approach no matter how fast they ran. Seconds stretched into eternities, each footfall loud as thunder in Benjamin's ears, each breath a betrayal of their position, each heartbeat a countdown to discovery or deliverance. Then they were crashing into the forest, into blessed darkness and concealing vegetation, and Benjamin allowed himself one moment of relief before his mind shifted entirely into survival mode. "Keep moving," he urged, pushing through underbrush that tore at their clothes, following the route he had memorized from his trip to Anderson Plantation, heading northeast toward the distant promise of freedom that lay hundreds of miles away through territory filled with slave catchers, patrols, informants, and 1,000 other dangers. Behind them, Thornhill Plantation was still quiet, still unaware that 5 pieces of valuable property had just stolen themselves, had just committed the unforgivable crime of claiming ownership of their own lives and bodies and futures. They traveled through the night with a desperate speed born of knowing that every mile between themselves and the plantation increased their slim chances of survival. Benjamin led them through forests and across streams, always moving northeast, always following the route he had planned in his mind during those weeks of careful preparation. Clara brought up the rear, making sure none of the children fell behind, carrying Eliza when the 5-year-old's legs grew too tired to continue, whispering encouragement when fatigue threatened to overwhelm them all. Samuel, despite being only 10, showed a maturity beyond his years, helping his younger sister Grace when she stumbled, never complaining about his own exhaustion, even though Benjamin could see the strain in the boy's face when moonlight filtered through the trees. Dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gray and pink when Benjamin finally called a halt, finding a thick copse of bushes where they could hide during the daylight hours. They had covered perhaps 12 miles, nowhere near enough to be safe, but enough to give them a head start before the alarm was raised and the pursuit began. "We rest here today," he whispered, gathering his family close in the hiding place. "We sleep in shifts, one person always watching. Come nightfall, we move again, keep putting distance between us and Thornhill. The first few days are the most dangerous, when they search in hardest, when the trail is freshest. We gotta stay smart, stay quiet, and stay together no matter what happens." He looked at each face. Clara, exhausted but determined. Samuel, frightened but trying to be brave. Grace, watching everything with those observant eyes that missed nothing. Eliza, too young to fully understand, but already learning that survival meant silence. The day passed with agonizing slowness, every sound of the forest making them tense with fear that it might be hunters or dogs or slave catchers who had already picked up their trail. They took turns sleeping, but it was the kind of sleep that brought no real rest,
filled with nightmares of capture and separation, of children being torn from parents' arms, of all the horrors they had seen inflicted on others who had tried to escape. When Clara woke from such a nightmare with a barely suppressed gasp, Benjamin held her close and whispered the only truth he had to offer. "We ain't caught yet. We still fighting, still moving toward freedom. That's something, even if it's not everything." As the sun climbed higher, they heard in the distance what they had been dreading, the sound of dogs, the shouts of men, the signs of organized search parties spreading out from Thornhill Plantation to find the escaped slaves and bring them back for punishment.
The pursuit had begun earlier than Benjamin had hoped, which meant someone had discovered their absence during the morning roll call, which meant Thornhill or the overseer had immediately organized a search party rather than waiting, which meant they were taking this escape attempt seriously, probably because Benjamin and Clara were valuable property and the children represented future profits. "They comin'," Samuel whispered, his young face showing the fear he was trying so hard to control. "The dogs gon' find us, ain't they, Papa? Gon' track us down, and then we all gon' be punished." Benjamin pulled his son close, felt the boy trembling, and made a decision that would test everything he had learned about psychology and strategy during his 32 years of surviving slavery. "The dogs can only track us if we leave a trail for them to follow," he said quietly, his mind already working through possibilities. "We've been moving through water when we can, which helps hide our scent. But now we go and do something they won't expect, something that goes against every instinct of running away." He looked at Clara, saw understanding dawning in her eyes, saw her nod even before he explained his plan. "We gon' circle back, move parallel to the plantation instead of straight away from it, put ourselves in the last place they expect to find us. Then, when they exhausted themselves searching in the wrong direction, when they think maybe we got further than we did, we slip past them and continue north. It's risky, but running straight north when they expect us to run straight north is even riskier." The strategy was sound but terrifying, requiring them to move closer to danger rather than away from it, to rely on the searchers' assumptions about how fugitive slaves behaved, rather than on distance and speed. They waited until the sounds of the search party had moved past their position, heading northeast in the direction any sensible runaway would go. And then Benjamin led his family in a wide arc, moving southeast and then east, paralleling the plantation at a distance of about 2 miles. Staying in the thick forest where visibility was poor and sound was muffled by vegetation. It was psychological warfare, using his understanding of how slave catchers thought against them, gambling that they would pursue the obvious trail rather than considering that fugitives might double back. The gamble worked, at least for that first critical day. By the time evening approached and they prepared to move again, the sounds of the search party were distant, moving in the wrong direction, giving the family the window they needed to continue their journey north. But Benjamin knew this advantage was temporary, that once the searchers realized they had been outsmarted, they would expand their search pattern, bring in more resources, possibly post rewards that would turn every white person in Georgia into a potential slave catcher.
"We can't get comfortable," he told Clara as they prepared to move again. "Can't think we safe just because we fooled them once. Gotta stay sharp, stay careful, keep thinking 3 steps ahead of everybody who hunting us." The second night of travel brought new challenges as fatigue began to take its toll on their bodies and spirits. Little Eliza cried silently, tears streaming down her face as her legs refused to carry her any further, and Benjamin carried her on his back while Clara supported Grace, who was struggling to keep up the pace. Samuel tried to be strong, tried to keep moving without complaint, but even he eventually stumbled and fell, exhaustion overcoming his determination to be brave. They rested more frequently that night, which meant covering less distance, which meant the margin between them and capture grew thinner with every hour. Benjamin felt the weight of leadership pressing down on him like a physical burden, the knowledge that 4 people depended entirely on his decisions, that one wrong choice could doom them all. But they also found help in an unexpected place, a reminder that resistance to slavery took many forms and existed in surprising locations. As dawn approached and they searched for a place to hide for the second day, they encountered an elderly black woman, free by some miracle Benjamin didn't have time to understand, who was gathering herbs in the forest for remedies she sold to both white and black people in the area. Her name was Ruth, and she took one look at the exhausted family and understood immediately what they were attempting, what they needed. "Come with me," she said without preamble, leading them to a small cabin hidden deep in the woods, a place where fugitives could rest before continuing their journey north. "You ain't the first I've helped, won't be the last. Stay here today, rest proper, get your strength back. Tonight I'll show you the route to the next safe place, a farm owned by Quakers who help runaways. But you gotta understand something. The danger only gets worse from here, not better. Sure you want to continue? Sure you want to risk these babies on a journey that kills more people than it frees?" The question forced Benjamin and Clara to confront what they had been trying not to think about, the statistical reality that most escape attempts failed,
that most fugitive slaves were captured and returned to face horrors to break them. But they also knew that staying meant watching their children be sold away, meant accepting the gradual destruction of their family, meant giving up without even trying to fight for something better. "We sure," Clara said firmly, speaking for both of them, "might fail, might die trying, but at least we'll die fighting for our children, instead of living as witnesses to their slow destruction. That's got to count for something, even if we don't make it."
Ruth nodded, seeming to respect their decision, even as she clearly thought it might be futile. She fed them properly for the first time since their escape, real food that filled their empty stomachs and gave them energy for the journey ahead. She tended to the blisters on their feet, gave them better shoes that she had collected from previous runaways who had passed through, and most importantly, she gave them information. "The route north is dangerous but possible," she explained, showing them a rough map she had drawn based on the experiences of others who had made the journey. "You got to get through Georgia first, then South Carolina, then North Carolina and Virginia, before you even reach the Free States. That's hundreds of miles through territory where every white person is a potential enemy, and even some black people might betray you for rewards. But there are safe houses along the way, people who will help if you know the right words to say, the right signs to look for. I'm going to teach you those words and signs, going to give you the best chance I can, but after that, it's up to you and God and the strength you can find in yourselves." The education Ruth provided that day was invaluable, a crash course in Underground Railroad protocols that would make the difference between successful escape and capture. She taught them the passwords that would identify them to conductors, the signals that marked safe houses, the routes that were most reliable and which ones had been compromised. She warned them about professional slave catchers who made their living hunting fugitives, about dogs trained specifically for tracking humans, about the Fugitive Slave Act that made even reaching northern states no guarantee of safety, since federal law required the return of escaped slaves to their enslavers. "Your best hope is Canada," she said bluntly. "That's the only place you're truly safe, where American law can't reach you, where you can live without always looking over your shoulder, waiting to be dragged back. But Canada is 1,000 miles away, and winter is coming, and you got young children who won't survive that kind of journey. You might need to stop in a northern city, find work, build a life, while always knowing you could be captured at any moment." The information was overwhelming, but also necessary, giving them realistic expectations about what they faced, rather than false hope that would make them careless. Benjamin absorbed every word, his analytical mind organizing the information into mental categories, assessing risks and planning contingencies with the same precision he brought to carpentry. Clara asked questions about how to keep children quiet when danger was near, about edible plants they might find along the way, about medical care if someone got sick or injured. Samuel listened with an intensity unusual for a 10-year-old, already understanding that he would need to remember everything if the family was going to survive. Even Grace and little Eliza sat quietly, sensing the gravity of the moment, beginning to understand that this was not an adventure, but a fight for their lives. As evening approached, Ruth prepared them for the next leg of their journey, a 15-mile trek to the Quaker farm where they would find their next safe haven. "The family name is Parker," she explained. "William and Hannah Parker. They abolitionists who believe slavery is a sin against God and humanity. They've helped dozens of fugitives over the years, built a special hiding place in their barn where slave catchers have searched multiple times without finding anybody. But getting there is the challenge. You gotta cross 2 roads that are patrolled regular, gotta pass within a mile of a town where there's always people about, gotta do it all while keeping 3 young children quiet and moving. You think you can manage that?" Benjamin looked at his family, saw the exhaustion and fear, but also the determination, saw 3 children who had already proven themselves braver than most adults would be in similar circumstances, saw a wife who was his equal in courage and intelligence, and who would die fighting before she let their children be taken back to slavery. "We can manage," he said, with a confidence he didn't entirely feel, but knew he needed to project for the sake of his family's morale. "We got this far by using our minds, by thinking strategically, by refusing to give up. We'll get to the Parker farm, and then we'll get to the next safe place, and then the next, until we either reach freedom or die trying. That's the only choice we got, and we made our peace with it." They left Ruth's cabin as darkness fell, better prepared than they had been, but also more aware of the immense challenges ahead. The route to the Parker farm took them through varied terrain, thick forests where progress was slow but safety was higher, open farmland where they had to move quickly while exposed, residential areas where they crept past sleeping households with hearts hammering in terror of barking dogs or waking residents,
Twice they had to hide in ditches while patrols passed on nearby roads, pressing themselves into the mud and forcing the children to remain absolutely silent while men with guns and dogs passed within yards of their hiding place. The psychological toll of this constant fear was almost worse than the physical exhaustion, wearing away at their spirits even as they forced their bodies to continue moving. But they also discovered reserves of strength they hadn't known they possessed, found that human beings can endure far more than they believe possible when survival demands it. When Grace couldn't walk another step, Samuel helped carry her despite his own exhaustion. When Clara's feet were bleeding from blisters that had burst and become infected, Benjamin fashioned better wrappings from strips torn from his shirt.
When little Eliza started to cry from hunger and fear, all of them took turns comforting her, singing whispered songs, telling quiet stories, doing whatever it took to keep moving, keep fighting, keep believing that freedom was possible if they just didn't give up. Dawn found them still a mile from the Parker farm, caught in open country with nowhere to hide as the sun began to illuminate their position. This was the moment Benjamin had been dreading, when they would be most visible, most vulnerable, most likely to be spotted by early rising farmers or travelers on the road. "We got to risk it," he said, making a command decision that could either save them or doom them. "We got to move fast in the open, get to the Parker farm before full daylight. If we get caught now, after coming this far, after everything we've been through, I won't be able to live with myself. So we run like our lives depend on it, because they do, and we don't stop until we reach that farm or until they catch us. Everybody understand?" 5 heads nodded, and then they were running again, the 5 members of a family that refused to be separated, refused to accept that their children were property, refused to stop fighting even when every rational calculation suggested they should give up. They reached the Parker farm with perhaps 15 minutes to spare before the area would have been fully lit by morning sun. Stumbling up to the barn with the last of their strength, gasping for breath, near collapse from exhaustion and fear and the sustained physical effort of 3 nights of running. Benjamin knocked on the barn door in the pattern Ruth had taught them, a specific rhythm that would identify them as fugitives needing help, and prayed that the Parkers were home, were still operating as a safe house, hadn't been caught and prosecuted for their abolitionist activities. The door opened to reveal a white man in his 50s, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes showing both caution and compassion as he took in the sight of the exhausted family on his doorstep. "You're safe here," William Parker said simply, and those 3 words were the most beautiful Benjamin had ever heard, a promise of temporary respite in a journey that seemed to have no end. Parker quickly ushered them into the barn, led them to the hiding place Ruth had mentioned, a false floor in one of the stalls that opened to reveal a space large enough for several people, ventilated and supplied with water and basic necessities. "Stay here during the day," instructed Parker. "Don't make noise, don't come out even if you hear people searching. My wife will bring food and water when it's safe. Tonight, after dark, we'll get you started on the next leg of your journey. You're doing well, making better time than most, but you've got a long way to go still. Georgia is just the beginning. You ready for what comes next?" The question hung in the air as Benjamin and Clara settled their children into the hiding place, as they finally allowed themselves to rest after 3 nights of constant terror and physical exertion. Were they ready? Could anyone be ready for a journey like this? For the sustained courage it required to keep moving when every instinct screamed to find somewhere safe and hide forever? Benjamin didn't know, but he knew they didn't have a choice, knew that turning back would mean losing their children, knew that the only direction was forward, no matter how frightening that direction might be. "We're ready," he told Parker, speaking for his family. "We're ready because we have to be, because our children's futures depend on us not giving up, because we believe freedom is worth fighting for, even when the fight seems impossible to win." The day passed in a blur of exhausted sleep, interrupted by moments of heart-stopping fear when they heard voices above, heard the barn door open, heard the sounds of people searching for something or someone. But the Parker family's hiding place proved as secure as promised, and despite several visits from people who were clearly looking for fugitive slaves, they remained undetected. When Hannah Parker finally opened the hiding place that evening to bring them food and water, Benjamin saw in her face the same determination he felt in his own heart, the same belief that slavery was an abomination that needed to be fought, the same willingness to risk everything for the principle that all humans deserved freedom and dignity. "There are slave catchers in the area," Hannah Parker said quietly, as they ate the first hot meal they had had in days. "Professional hunters who know all the routes, all the safe houses, all the tricks that fugitives use. They're being paid well by your former master, who has posted significant rewards for your capture. You need to know that they're not going to give up easily, that they'll keep hunting until they find you, or until you get far enough north that continuing the search becomes unprofitable. What I'm saying is, you can't let your guard down.
Can't assume you're safe just because you've made it this far. The most dangerous part of the journey is still ahead. The warning was sobering, but necessary, a reminder that their escape attempt was far from over, that they had barely begun a journey that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But Benjamin also felt something shifting inside him, a transformation from a man reacting to circumstances to a man actively shaping his own destiny and that of his family. Slavery had tried to convince him that he was powerless, that he had no control over his life, that his intelligence and capabilities were meaningless in the face of white supremacy backed by law and violence.
But this journey was proving otherwise, was demonstrating that the human mind was indeed a weapon when wielded with courage and strategic thinking, that careful planning and intelligent resistance could overcome even the most brutal oppression. That night, the Parker family provided them with better supplies, warmer clothing for the cooling autumn nights, more durable shoes, a larger quantity of food that could sustain them for several days, and most importantly, detailed directions to the next safe house, a freed black community in South Carolina where they could rest before continuing north. "The people there are expecting you," William Parker explained, showing Benjamin a map that detailed the route. "They're conductors themselves, part of the network that extends all the way to Canada. But getting there means crossing into South Carolina, means passing through some of the most heavily patrolled territory in the South. You'll need to be smarter, more careful, more strategic than you've been so far. Think you can do that?" Benjamin studied the map, his analytical mind already working through the challenges, calculating distances and travel times, identifying potential dangers, and planning how to avoid or overcome them. This was what he was good at, this strategic thinking, this ability to see patterns and possibilities that others might miss. He had been forced to hide this intelligence his entire life, had been required to appear simple and subservient, while his mind worked at levels his enslavers never suspected. But now this hidden strength was becoming his family's salvation, was proving to be exactly the weapon they needed to fight a system that tried to reduce them to property. "We can do it," he said firmly. "We've learned a lot in these first few days, about what works and what doesn't, about how to read danger and avoid it. We'll make it to South Carolina, and then we'll make it beyond that, because we don't have any other choice." They left the Parker farm that night with renewed determination, better equipped and better informed, but also more aware of the enormous challenges that still lay ahead. The journey to the South Carolina safe house would take them through the most dangerous terrain yet, areas where slave patrols were frequent and where the population was deeply invested in maintaining slavery as an institution. Every white person they encountered would see them as either property to be captured and returned for reward, or as threats to the social order that needed to be eliminated. Even some black people might betray them, either from fear of punishment if they were found helping fugitives, or from the cynical calculation that rewards for turning in runaways might improve their own desperate circumstances. The fourth night of travel brought them to the South Carolina border, a geographical line that meant nothing legally since slavery was legal on both sides, but which represented a psychological milestone, a measure of progress in their desperate flight toward freedom. They crossed the Savannah River in the dead of night, wading through cold water that rose to the adults' chests and required Benjamin and Clara to carry the children on their shoulders, trying not to think about what would happen if one of them lost their footing and were swept away by the current. The water hid their scent from tracking dogs, but it also left them soaked and shivering in the autumn night, their teeth chattering as they found shelter in a thicket on the South Carolina side and tried to warm themselves enough to continue moving. Samuel was the first to show signs of illness, a fever that made his skin hot to the touch and his eyes glassy with delirium. Clara held him close, trying to warm him with her own body heat, whispering prayers and reassurances, even as fear clawed at her heart. Losing Samuel to illness after surviving 3 nights of flight would be a cruelty too great to bear, would prove that the universe had no mercy for enslaved people who dared to seek freedom. "We need medicine," she said to Benjamin, her voice breaking with barely suppressed panic. "Need something to bring down the fever, to fight whatever infection he's caught from the river water. How are we supposed to get that when we can't walk into a town and ask for help?" Benjamin's mind raced through options, none of them good, all of them carrying enormous risk. They could try to steal medicine from a white household, but theft would alert people to their presence and likely trigger immediate search parties. They could approach a black household and hope for help, but that meant trusting strangers with their lives, gambling that compassion would outweigh fear or the temptation of reward money. Or they could press on to the South Carolina safe house, hoping Samuel would survive another night of travel in his weakened condition,
hoping that the freed black community there would have access to medicine and the skills to use it. We keep moving, Benjamin decided, hating himself for making a choice that might kill his son, but also knowing that staying in one place was its own death sentence. We make it to the safe house, get Samuel proper help there. He's strong, Clara. He's survived this long, survived being born into slavery and growing up in it without being broken. He can survive one more night. But as they began moving again, Benjamin carrying his feverish son, while Clara managed the two girls, he found himself bargaining with a God he wasn't sure existed or cared about enslaved people. "Please," he whispered into the darkness, "please don't take my boy. Not now. Not after we've come so far. Not after we've fought so hard."
I'll do anything, be anything, sacrifice anything. Just let my son live to see freedom. That's all I'm asking, just that one mercy. Whether God was listening or whether Samuel's own strength was sufficient, the boy clung to life as they pushed through another night of desperate flight, his hot little body pressed against his father's back, his occasional whimpers of pain cutting through Benjamin's heart like knives. Dawn was breaking when they finally staggered into the freed black community that served as their next safe house, a collection of small farms and cabins where formerly enslaved people had built lives for themselves, where the Underground Railroad had established one of its most important stations in South Carolina. They were met by a woman named Sarah, herself a former slave who had purchased her freedom years earlier and now dedicated her life to helping others escape bondage. She took one look at Samuel's feverish state and immediately took charge, carrying the boy to her cabin, preparing herbal remedies that she had learned from her grandmother, speaking with the authority of someone who had seen this situation many times before and knew what needed to be done. "He's got river fever," Sarah diagnosed after examining Samuel carefully. "Comes from the water, from the cold and wet combined with exhaustion and poor nutrition. It's serious, but treatable if we act fast. He'll need to stay here for at least 3 days, maybe longer, while the herbs do their work and his body fights off the infection. That means you all need to stay, need to rest properly, need to let yourselves recover from the ordeal you've been through. I know you're anxious to keep moving, afraid that every moment you stay in one place increases the danger, but running yourself to death serves no purpose. Better to rest now and continue strong than to push on and have everyone collapse." The forced rest was both blessing and curse, giving their bodies time to heal, but also allowing their minds to dwell on the dangers that surrounded them, the knowledge that slave catchers were still hunting them, that rewards for their capture were being advertised throughout the region, that every day they remained in South Carolina was another day they could be discovered and dragged back to Georgia to face punishments too terrible to imagine. Benjamin spent those 3 days in a state of constant anxiety, unable to truly relax even though his body desperately needed rest, always listening for the sound of approaching horses, always watching for signs that their hiding place had been discovered. Clara devoted herself to nursing Samuel and comforting the two girls who were showing signs of trauma from their ordeal, nightmares that made them wake screaming, moments of tears for no apparent reason, the psychological wounds that would take far longer to heal than the physical ones. But the forced rest also gave them time to plan more carefully, to think beyond the immediate necessity of flight to the larger strategy of reaching freedom. Sarah shared information from the Underground Railroad network about routes and safe houses, about which areas were currently safe and which had been compromised by recent captures. She taught them more sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection, how to disguise themselves as free black people going about legitimate business, how to forge basic documents if they were stopped and questioned, how to read the subtle signs that indicated danger before it was too late to avoid it. "You've been lucky so far," she told them bluntly, "made some smart decisions, used your intelligence well, but you've also had luck on your side. Luck runs out eventually. What you need now is skill, knowledge, the ability to anticipate problems before they arise. That's what separates successful escapes from failed ones, not just courage, but strategic thinking." Samuel's fever broke on the 3rd day, his young body's resilience proving stronger than the infection that had threatened his life. The relief Benjamin and Clara felt was almost overwhelming, a reminder of how high the stakes were, how every moment of this journey carried the possibility of loss so profound it couldn't be contemplated without threatening their sanity. "Thank you," Benjamin said to Sarah, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't entirely control. "You saved my son's life, gave us a chance to continue fighting. How do we ever repay that kind of debt?" Sarah shook her head, smiling sadly.
"You don't repay it to me," she said. "You repay it by surviving, by reaching freedom, by building lives that honor the sacrifices made by everyone who helped you along the way. And someday, when you're safe and established, maybe you help the next person running from slavery. Pass forward the kindness that was shown to you. That's how this works. That's how the network sustains itself. Each person who makes it through turns around and helps the next person. That's the only repayment I want or need." They left the South Carolina safe house on the 7th night of their journey, significantly stronger than they had arrived, better educated about the challenges ahead, more aware of both their capabilities and their limitations. Sarah had provided them with better maps, with letters of introduction to the next stations on the railroad, with the names and locations of conductors who could be trusted. But she had also reinforced the sobering reality that they were still hundreds of miles from freedom, that the most difficult parts of their journey were still ahead, that North Carolina and Virginia would present challenges that would test them in ways they hadn't yet experienced.
The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of nighttime travel and daytime hiding, of close calls and narrow escapes, of moments when capture seemed inevitable, followed by desperate flights that somehow succeeded against all odds. They were chased by slave catchers twice more, escaping the first time by hiding in a swamp for 6 hours while dogs and men passed within feet of their position. The second time by using a technique Benjamin had devised, leaving a false trail in one direction while doubling back and moving in another, gambling that the hunters would follow the obvious signs rather than considering the possibility of misdirection. They received help from unexpected sources, a white farmer who had lost his own children to disease and couldn't bear to see another parent's children taken away, a freed black barber who hid them in his shop for 2 days while slave catchers searched the town, a Quaker family that risked imprisonment to provide them with forged freedom papers that might allow them to travel more openly. But they also witnessed the consequences when others failed, saw fugitive slaves captured and returned to face punishments designed to break their spirits and serve as warnings to anyone else who might consider running. They saw a man beaten so severely that he couldn't walk, then chained to a wagon and forced to follow behind on his hands and knees as he was transported back to his enslaver. They saw a woman separated from her infant child, the mother sent to one plantation while the baby was sold to another, both of them screaming as they were torn apart. They saw horrors that would haunt their dreams for years, that reinforced their understanding of exactly what would happen if their own escape failed, that strengthened their determination to succeed or die trying, because going back was literally worse than death. The nights grew colder as autumn deepened toward winter, and the family's inadequate clothing provided little protection against temperatures that dipped below freezing. They huddled together for warmth during rest stops, their breath misting in the cold air, their fingers and toes often numb despite their best efforts to keep moving, keep circulation going, keep hypothermia at bay. Little Eliza developed a persistent cough that terrified Clara because lung infections could kill children quickly, especially children weakened by poor nutrition and constant physical stress. Grace grew silent, retreating into herself as a way of coping with the sustained fear and hardship, and no amount of parental reassurance could bring back the smiling, talkative girl she had been before their escape. But Samuel, having survived his brush with death from river fever, seemed to draw strength from the experience, becoming more resilient, more capable, more like a young man than a child. He helped his father with increasingly complex tasks, learned to navigate by the stars, became adept at reading terrain and identifying safe routes versus dangerous ones. Benjamin watched his son's transformation with a mixture of pride and sadness, grateful for Samuel's growing capabilities, but also mourning the childhood the boy was losing, the innocence being stripped away by the harsh necessities of survival. "You're doing good, son," he told Samuel one night as they kept watch together while the others slept. "Your mama and I, we proud how strong you bein', how brave. But we also sorry that you gotta grow up so fast, gotta see and experience things no child should have to endure. We doing this for you, for your future, for the chance that you might grow up free and build a life you choose for yourself. Just want you to know that. Want you to understand that all this hardship is for something, is working towards something better." Samuel looked at his father with eyes that seemed far older than his 10 years, eyes that had seen too much, understood too well the brutal realities of the world they lived in. "I know, Papa," he said quietly. "I know we running so I don't have to grow up being somebody's property, so Grace and Eliza don't have to live the life Mama lived. I understand what we fighting for, and I ain't gonna give up, ain't gonna let the family down. We gonna make it to freedom. Gonna prove that we're smarter and stronger than the people trying to keep us enslaved. That's what I believe, Papa. That's what keeps me going when I'm so tired I can barely walk." The North Carolina border arrived after what felt like years, but was actually only 3 weeks.
3 weeks that had transformed them all, hardened them, taught them things about themselves they never would have learned in the relative safety of slavery. They crossed into North Carolina with a mixture of relief at their progress and dread at what still lay ahead, because Virginia loomed beyond North Carolina, and beyond Virginia were Maryland and Delaware, and only after crossing all those states would they reach Pennsylvania and something approaching freedom. The journey that had seemed theoretically possible when they started was revealing itself to be even more difficult than they had imagined, a sustained ordeal that required reserves of strength they sometimes feared they didn't possess. But they also discovered that resistance to slavery was more widespread than they had been led to believe, that there were people throughout the South who opposed the institution and were willing to risk themselves to help fugitives escape. They met white Southerners who had never owned slaves and resented the planter class that dominated politics and economics, who saw helping runaways as a form of rebellion against the system that oppressed poor whites almost as thoroughly as it oppressed black people.
They met ministers who believed slavery was a sin against God and who used their churches as hiding places for fugitives. They met women who couldn't bear to see families separated and who defied their own husbands to provide food and shelter to running slaves. Each act of kindness, each moment of solidarity, reinforced Benjamin's belief that slavery was not as secure as its defenders claimed, that the system contained within it the seeds of its own destruction, because it violated fundamental human values that could never be entirely suppressed. The climax of their journey came on a cold November night in Virginia, when they were within 100 miles of the Pennsylvania border, within touching distance of freedom, but found themselves trapped between two converging groups of slave catchers who had been tracking them for days. They were in a narrow valley with steep ridges on either side, and the sound of dogs and men approached from both ends, cutting off escape routes, forcing them into a position where capture seemed inevitable. This was the moment Benjamin had feared from the beginning, the moment when all their planning and courage and intelligence would prove insufficient, when the overwhelming resources arrayed against them would finally succeed in dragging them back to slavery. "We gotta split up," Benjamin said urgently, his mind racing through impossible calculations, trying to find some strategy that might save at least some of them. "Clara, you take the girls and head east up the ridge. Move quiet and slow so you don't attract attention. Me and Samuel, we'll head west. Make noise, draw the hunters after us so you get a chance to escape. If we get caught, you keep going. You make it to freedom with the girls. You tell them about us, about how we tried, about how we love them. You hear me, Clara? You promise me that if it comes down to it, you'll save yourself and the girls and not look back." But Clara grabbed his arm with a grip like iron, her eyes fierce in the darkness, her voice leaving no room for argument. "We don't split up," she said firmly. "We started this together, we're ending it together, whatever that ending is. Our children need both their parents, need both of us to teach them how to be strong, how to survive, how to be free. You think I'm going to tell them their papa sacrificed himself so we could escape? You think they could live with that? Could grow up knowing their freedom cost their father's life? No. We find another way, or we go down together, but we don't split this family apart. That's exactly what the slaveholders want. That's exactly what slavery does. We refuse to let them win that way."
Her words crystallized something in Benjamin's mind, a realization that had been building throughout their journey, but only now became crystal clear. The greatest threat of slavery wasn't physical bondage, but psychological bondage, the acceptance that separation and powerlessness were inevitable, that families could be torn apart at will, that love and loyalty were luxuries that enslaved people couldn't afford. By refusing to split up, by insisting that they would stand together regardless of the consequences, Clara was claiming their humanity in the most fundamental way possible, was asserting that their family bonds were more important than survival itself, that some things were worth dying for, even if they couldn't be achieved through living. "Then we fight," Benjamin said, pulling out the knife he had carried throughout their journey, a weapon that seemed laughably inadequate against men with guns and dogs, but which represented his refusal to surrender without resistance. "We climb that ridge together, all 5 of us, and we defend our position if they find us. Maybe we die, but we die as a family, die fighting for our freedom rather than living in chains. And maybe, just maybe, we're smart enough and brave enough to find a way out that we haven't thought of yet, some strategy that will save us all. But Clara's right. We don't split up. We don't sacrifice anyone. We stand together, because that's what families do. That's what love means when everything else has been stripped away." They began climbing the eastern ridge as quickly as they could while maintaining silence,
hoping against hope that they could reach the top and disappear over the other side before the converging slave catchers reached their position. Benjamin and Clara carried the two younger children, while Samuel climbed on his own, all of them moving with a desperation born of knowing that this might be their last moments of freedom, their last moments together as a family. The ridge was steep and treacherous, loose stones giving way beneath their feet, branches scratching their faces and hands, every movement feeling dangerously loud despite their best efforts at silence. They were halfway up when they heard the dogs close in, heard the excited baying that meant the animals had found fresh scent, heard the shouts of men coordinating their search. "They know we hear," Samuel whispered, his voice remarkably calm for a child facing possible death or capture. "They closing in on this position. What we do now, Papa?" Benjamin looked at his son, at his wife, at his two daughters, and felt a surge of love so powerful it almost broke him. These four people were his entire world, the reason he had lived through 32 years of slavery, the purpose that gave meaning to his existence.
If this was the end, if they were about to be captured after coming so far, at least they would face it together, would show their children that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. But then Grace, silent Grace, who had barely spoken in weeks, pointed up the ridge to something Benjamin hadn't noticed in the darkness. A cave opening, small and partially hidden by vegetation, barely large enough for a family to squeeze into, but possibly offering concealment if they could reach it before the hunters spotted them. "There," Grace whispered, her first words in days. "We hide there. Let them pass by if they don't look too close. It's small enough that the dogs might not smell us if the wind is right, might not think to check because it don't look big enough for people to fit." The observation was brilliant, exactly the kind of strategic thinking that had saved them multiple times already, and Benjamin felt a rush of hope that maybe, just maybe, they might survive this after all. They scrambled toward the cave opening with the last of their strength, squeezing through the narrow entrance into a space that was barely large enough for 5 people, pressing themselves back as far as possible while trying to control their ragged breathing, their hammering hearts, the terror that threatened to overwhelm them all. Outside, they heard the hunters converge on their position, heard dogs sniffing around the base of the ridge, heard men debating whether the fugitives had climbed the slope or had moved in another direction. "Check that cave," someone said, and Benjamin felt his heart stop as he heard footsteps approaching their hiding place, heard a man muttering about how he'd better not find a rattlesnake in there while he was checking for runaway slaves. A face appeared at the cave entrance, white face with a scraggly beard and cold eyes that swept the interior, and for a moment Benjamin was certain they had been spotted, certain that their journey was over. But the cave was deeper than it appeared from outside, and the family had pressed themselves into a depression at the back that made them invisible to casual inspection, especially in the darkness of night. The slave catcher's eyes passed over their position without seeing them, dismissed the cave as too small to hide anyone, and withdrew with a curse about wasting his time on false leads. Benjamin held his breath, held his children close, felt Sarah's hand gripping his with desperate hope as they listened to the hunters debate their next move. "They must have kept moving," the lead hunter finally decided. "Probably crossed the valley and started up the western ridge. Let's spread out and search that direction. And remember, the reward is for them alive, but dead is acceptable if they resist. These particular slaves are dangerous, killed an overseer during their escape, so don't take chances if you spot them." The lie was blatant, a fabrication designed to justify extreme violence if the family was found. But it also revealed how seriously their escape was being taken, how much resources their former master had invested in their capture. The hunters moved off, their voices and the sounds of their dogs fading into the distance, and the family remained frozen in the cave for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, terrified that any movement would alert hunters who might still be within earshot. When they finally emerged from the cave, shaking with reaction to how close they had come to capture, Benjamin pulled his family into a tight embrace, holding them all while silent tears ran down his face. "You saved us, Grace," he whispered to his daughter. "Your sharp eyes and quick thinking saved the whole family. You're brave and smart and strong, and I'm so proud to be your papa." Grace buried her face in his chest, and he felt her small body shaking with sobs she had been holding in for weeks, finally allowing herself to feel and express the terror she had been suppressing. They held each other in the darkness, 5 people who had survived another brush with capture, who were still free, still together, still fighting for a future they could barely imagine, but refused to stop believing in. The rest of the climb up and over the ridge was accomplished in a daze of exhaustion and relief, and when they finally descended the other side and found themselves in a valley that offered multiple escape routes, Benjamin felt something shift in his understanding of their journey. They had survived not just through luck, but through intelligence, courage, and the willingness to support each other when individual strength failed.
They had used their minds as weapons, just as Clara had insisted from the beginning, outthinking their pursuers, anticipating problems, adapting to changing circumstances with a flexibility that rigid systems couldn't match. They were proving that enslaved people were not passive victims but active agents in their own liberation, that the power dynamics of slavery were not as fixed as the slaveholders claimed, that intelligence and determination could overcome even tremendous disparities in resources and legal authority. The final weeks of their journey passed with a dream-like quality, each day bringing them closer to Pennsylvania, to freedom, to the end of a journey that had transformed them all. They received help from conductors on the Underground Railroad who had become part of the network specifically because of stories like theirs, people who were inspired by the courage of families fleeing slavery and who wanted to be part of that resistance, that great moral struggle that was tearing the nation apart. They stayed in homes where abolitionist families fed them, clothed them, provided medical care, and treated them not as escaped property, but as human beings deserving of dignity and respect.
Each act of kindness, each moment of genuine human connection began to heal some of the psychological wounds that slavery had inflicted, began to show them what life might be like in a world where they weren't constantly dehumanized and threatened. The Pennsylvania border appeared one cold December morning, a geographical line that meant everything and nothing, that represented legal freedom but not necessarily safety, that marked both an ending and a beginning. Benjamin led his family across that line with tears streaming down his face, feeling the weight of what they had accomplished, the magnitude of what they had survived, the miracle that all 5 of them were still together, still alive, still capable of building the future they had risked everything to claim. "We made it," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "We actually made it, used our minds and our courage and our love for each other to do what they said was impossible. We broke our chains, saved our children from inheriting our bondage, proved that we are human beings with rights and dignity that no law can legitimately deny." They settled in Philadelphia initially, finding community among the city's large population of free black people and formerly enslaved people who had made similar journeys. Benjamin found work as a carpenter, his skills in high demand and fairly compensated for the first time in his life. Clara worked as a cook in a restaurant that served both black and white customers without segregation, experiencing for the first time what it meant to have employment that didn't involve constant humiliation and fear. The children attended school, learned to read and write, began developing talents and interests that would shape their futures. Samuel eventually became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating formerly enslaved people and their children. Grace became a writer, documenting the stories of people who had escaped slavery so their courage would be remembered by future generations. Eliza, who had been so young during their escape, grew up to be an activist in the abolitionist movement, speaking at rallies and helping to organize resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act. But none of them ever forgot the journey that had brought them to freedom, the weeks of terror and hardship that had tested them in ways that would mark them forever. Benjamin often woke in the night from dreams of being chased, of hearing dogs baying in the distance, of the moment in the cave when discovery seemed inevitable and survival seemed impossible. Clara carried scars on her feet from the brutal miles they had traveled, physical reminders of the journey that paralleled the psychological scars all of them bore. They attended church in a free black congregation where formerly enslaved people gathered to worship, to support each other, to remember those who hadn't made it, to honor the sacrifice of everyone who had died fighting slavery or helping others escape it.
And they told their story again and again to anyone who would listen, because they understood that their personal experience was also a political statement, a refutation of everything slavery's defenders claimed about enslaved people being content in their bondage, lacking intelligence and initiative, needing white masters to guide them because they were incapable of managing their own lives. By simply existing, by surviving and thriving and building successful lives, they proved the lie at the heart of slavery, demonstrated that the real barrier to black achievement was not inherent inferiority, but rather the systematic oppression that denied education, opportunity, and basic human rights. "Our minds were our greatest weapons," Benjamin often said when speaking to groups about his family's escape. "They tried to convince us we weren't smart enough to plan our own liberation, weren't capable of strategic thinking, weren't fully human in our intelligence and emotions. But we proved them wrong every single day of that journey. We outsmarted slave catchers, anticipated problems, solved puzzles that would have defeated people who thought themselves our superiors. And we did it not for ourselves alone, but for our children, for their right to grow up free, for their chance to develop their own talents and build their own lives. That's what parents do.
We fight for our children's futures, even when that fight seems impossible, even when the odds are overwhelming, even when failure might mean death. We fight because love demands it, because humanity requires it, because accepting slavery means accepting the death of everything that makes life worth living. The years passed, and the family watched as the nation moved toward the inevitable confrontation over slavery that would become the Civil War. They saw the election of Abraham Lincoln, saw the secession of Southern states, saw the beginning of armed conflict that would ultimately free 4 million enslaved people. Benjamin and Clara wanted to feel satisfaction that slavery was finally being challenged at the national level, but they also felt grief for all the people who had died in slavery before freedom came, for all the families that had been separated, for all the children who had grown up in bondage and would carry those scars forever. We were lucky, Clara often reflected. Lucky we had each other. Lucky we made it. Lucky our children got to grow up free. But what about all the others who weren't so lucky? What about the thousands who tried to escape and failed, who died trying, who were caught and punished? We owe them something. Owe them the responsibility to make sure slavery never happens again, to make sure their suffering meant something.
After the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, Benjamin and Clara became involved in the work of Reconstruction, helping formerly enslaved people adjust to freedom, teaching them to read and write, helping them navigate the legal system, supporting them as they built new lives in a society that had changed legally, but not necessarily in the hearts and minds of white people who still believed in black inferiority. They saw that freedom was more complicated than they had imagined during their desperate flight from Georgia, that legal emancipation didn't automatically translate into social equality or economic opportunity, that the fight they had begun by escaping slavery was actually part of a much larger struggle that would continue for generations. "We thought freedom was the destination," Benjamin said near the end of his life, looking back on decades of struggle and progress and setbacks. "Thought that once we crossed that Pennsylvania border, once slavery was legally ended, the fight would be over. But we learned that freedom is not a destination, but a journey, something that has to be defended and expanded and fought for in every generation. We used our minds as weapons to escape physical slavery, but our children and grandchildren will need to use their minds to fight economic slavery, social slavery, the slavery of prejudice and discrimination that persists even after the chains have been legally broken. The fight continues, must continue, until every human being is truly free, truly equal, truly recognized as deserving of dignity and opportunity, regardless of the color of their skin." Benjamin died in 1889 at the age of 65, surrounded by his wife, his children, his grandchildren, a family that existed because two people had refused to accept that their children were property, had used intelligence and courage to fight a system designed to be inescapable. His funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched, formerly enslaved people he had helped, abolitionists he had worked with, students he had mentored. Clara spoke at his funeral, her voice still strong despite her own advanced age, reminding everyone present that Benjamin's greatest legacy was not his escape from slavery, but what he had done with his freedom, how he had used his survival to help others, to fight for justice, to demonstrate that human worth was not determined by race or legal status, but by character and actions. Clara lived another 6 years, dying in 1895 at the age of 69, having witnessed the post-Reconstruction backlash that saw many of the gains of the Civil War era rolled back, seeing the rise of Jim Crow laws that created a new form of oppression to replace the slavery that had been legally abolished. Her last words to her gathered family were both a warning and a challenge. "Don't ever forget where you came from, what it cost to get here, what people sacrificed so you could be free.
And don't accept that freedom is secure, that the battle is won, that you can rest easy. Every generation has to fight for freedom, has to defend it against people who want to take it away, has to expand it to include everyone, or it means nothing. You are the descendants of people who used their minds as weapons, who fought for the souls of their children, who proved that intelligence and courage can overcome even the most brutal oppression. Live up to that legacy. Make our struggles mean something. And never, ever accept that any human being is less than fully human, fully deserving of freedom and dignity and opportunity. The story of Benjamin and Clara, of Samuel and Grace and Eliza, became one of thousands of stories documenting the courage of enslaved people who escaped bondage, who used the Underground Railroad, who fought their way to freedom despite overwhelming odds. Their story was preserved by their descendants, written down by Grace, who became a historian of the Underground Railroad,
passed through generations as a reminder of where the family had come from and what had been sacrificed to give them the opportunities they enjoyed. It became part of the historical record that proved enslaved people were not passive victims, but active resistors, that the Underground Railroad was not run primarily by white abolitionists, but by black conductors who made repeated trips back to the South to guide others to freedom, that the intelligence and strategic thinking of enslaved people was a weapon more powerful than any physical force. And now, as we conclude this extraordinary story, we must recognize that it is not just history, but also prophecy, not just a tale of the past, but a challenge for the present and future. Benjamin and Clara used their minds as weapons to fight physical slavery, proving that intelligence and courage can overcome brutal oppression. Their descendants would need to use their minds to fight other forms of slavery, economic oppression, educational discrimination, the prison industrial complex, the subtle and not so subtle forms of racism that persist generations after slavery's legal end. The fight they began continues, must continue, will continue, as long as any human being is denied freedom, dignity, or opportunity, based on race or any other characteristic they cannot control. If this story has moved you, if it has inspired you to think about courage and resistance and the power of the human mind to overcome oppression, then I ask you to honor Benjamin and Clara's legacy by subscribing to this channel, sharing these stories, refusing to let them be forgotten. These are the stories that need to be told and retold, the narratives that prove human dignity cannot be permanently suppressed, that systems of oppression contain within them the seeds of their own destruction, that love and intelligence and determination can achieve what seems impossible.
Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us in keeping these stories alive for future generations. In the end, what is the lesson of Benjamin and Clara's story? It is this, that the human mind is indeed a weapon when wielded with courage and purpose, that fighting for the souls of children is the most fundamental human impulse and cannot be suppressed even by the most brutal systems, that intelligence and strategic thinking can overcome disparities in power and resources, that families have a strength that no law can break and no violence can destroy. They were enslaved people who refused to let their children inherit their chains, who used everything they had learned during years of oppression to plan and execute an escape that should have been impossible, who proved that human beings cannot be truly enslaved as long as they retain the capacity to think, to plan, to hope, to love. Their story is unique in its details, but universal in its themes. Every person who has ever fought oppression, who has ever used intelligence to overcome brute force, who has ever risked everything for the sake of their children or their principles, is part of the same story, the same eternal human struggle for freedom and dignity that transcends time and place and specific circumstances. Benjamin and Clara lived in 1850s America, escaped from chattel slavery, faced danger specific to their time and place. But their courage, their intelligence, their love, their refusal to accept permanent bondage, these qualities are timeless, universal, part of what makes us human, regardless of when or where we live. We honor them not with pity for what they endured, but with admiration for what they accomplished. We remember them not as victors of slavery, but as victors over it. People who claimed their freedom and their children's futures, despite a system designed to make such claiming impossible. We carry forward their legacy by recognizing that the fight they fought continues in different forms, that oppression wears different masks in different eras, but remains fundamentally the same in its denial of human dignity, that resistance requires the same courage and intelligence and determination regardless of the specific chains we are fighting. Benjamin and Clara taught us that the greatest weapon against oppression is the human mind, properly educated and strategically deployed, refusing to accept the limits that oppressors try to impose, seeing possibilities where others see only impossibilities. They taught us that fighting for children is the most powerful motivation humans can experience, that parents will endure anything, risk everything, overcome any obstacle when their children's futures are at stake. They taught us that families are not just biological connections, but bonds of love and loyalty that can survive any test, that can provide strength when individual strength fails, that can make the impossible possible through mutual support and shared determination. They taught us that slavery, in whatever form it takes, is ultimately unsustainable because it violates fundamental human needs and values that cannot be permanently suppressed. They taught us that the oppressed are not passive victims waiting to be saved by benevolent outsiders, but active agents in their own liberation, capable of extraordinary intelligence and courage when circumstances demand it. They taught us that freedom is not a gift to be granted by those in power, but a right to be claimed by those without power. That liberation is something we do for ourselves rather than something done to us or for us. And finally, they taught us that every generation has a responsibility to remember, to honor, to learn from the struggles of those who came before, and to apply those lessons to the struggles of the present. We cannot undo the suffering of the past, cannot bring back the people who died in slavery or who died fighting it. But we can ensure their suffering was not in vain by continuing the work they began, by fighting oppression wherever we encounter it, by refusing to accept that any human being is less than fully human, by using our minds as weapons against every system that denies dignity and freedom to any person. So let us close with this reflection. Benjamin and Clara and their 3 children walked out of slavery and into freedom, using nothing but their courage, their intelligence, their love, and their refusal to accept that their chains were unbreakable. They proved that the most powerful weapon against oppression is the human mind, properly prepared and courageously deployed, seeing clearly through lies and propaganda to the fundamental truth that all humans are created equal, that all deserve freedom, that all possess dignity that no law can legitimately deny. Their story is our story. Their fight is our fight. Their victory is our inspiration. May we live worthy of their sacrifice. May we continue their struggle. May we never forget what they taught us about the power of the human spirit to overcome even the most brutal oppression. And may their souls rest in peace, knowing that their courage changed not just their own lives, but the lives of generations yet unborn, proving that slavery could be beaten, that freedom could be won, that human dignity could survive and triumph against all odds. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Benjamin and Clara's extraordinary story. Remember to subscribe, share these stories, and carry forward the legacy of those who fought for freedom. Their courage lights the way for all of us.